Well, hello, good morning and welcome. I'm Mark Cooper and this is my wildlife channel, Camilla and I. Anyway, today on Camilla and I thought we might discuss how I went from this to this. So if you're just starting in outdoor photography and can't decide between landscape photography and wildlife photography, this video could be the one for you. If you are a landscape photographer and fancy doing some wildlife, then this also could be the video for you. This may come as a bit of a shock to some of my regular viewers, but I did actually start in digital photography with landscapes, although this channel is totally dedicated to wildlife photography, except for today. So what I thought would be useful if I set myself a series of questions which in some ways chart my progression from a landscape photographer to a wildlife photographer. So I thought in between a smattering of my landscape and wildlife pictures, one wildlife picture, one landscape picture, I'll try and explain eventually why I moved largely away from landscapes to wildlife. Anyway, let's crack on and see where we get to. Up with the first question. Well, in one word, it's wildlife photography. Landscape subjects are largely static and wildlife subjects can be erratic, and you've got a very limited opportunity to fiddle with those dials. No time for filters in wildlife photography. You have to work with the light available to you, and this has its constraints. Yeah, without a doubt, wildlife photography, I would say, is far more difficult than landscapes. So the next question is, which is cheaper, landscape or wildlife photography? And again, I would go for wildlife photography being the more expensive. To start with, anyway, you can start with a mobile phone landscape photography. There's no reason to invest thousands of pounds in camera equipment, but the wildlife tends to be a bit further off generally, so you have to invest more money in more reach. So this is a consideration. So and indeed, when you progress in wildlife photography, I mean, a 600mm lens, that extra focal length is far more expensive than, say, a wide-angle lens. It's not to say that landscape photography is at all cheap. I mean, I would recommend, for example, you invest in a good set of filters once you get into wildlife photography seriously, and these indeed can cost you as much as the price of a wide-angle lens. So neither one as a hobby is cheap, but certainly landscape is cheaper. is, of course, yes to both. You have to be out early and you have to be out late. And indeed, for both areas of photography, the golden hour, as usual, is the best time to be outdoors taking photographs. So the answer to this one is yes, both. And indeed, in the winter, if you're wrapped up warm enough, you can go out for a lot longer. And indeed, I would suggest, particularly wildlife photography, you can then do it virtually all day. If the sun doesn't get too high in the sky, you've still got some very good clear light. Well, yes, you can, and it's certainly possible, but it is more difficult. As previously mentioned, the best time to be out, of course, is exactly the same time as you want to be out for wildlife photography, is as you want to be out for landscape photography, as it takes, can be 20 minutes, half an hour to set up your landscape shot. You could be missing an awful lot of wildlife shots in the process of taking your landscape. So you could take out 2 camera bodies, one set with a wide angle lens and one with a telephoto lens. And yes, this would limit your setup time, and then you could potentially do both. But can you be in 2 places at once? This is the question. Because some of the wildlife is not as wild as you'd like to think. I'll give an example here. There's a kingfisher on the River Stour at the moment that I've heard about, and the only problem is, if you were doing both wildlife and nature photography, you'd get some lovely pictures of the kingfisher, but also if you chose to do the landscape in the area, you'd get some lovely pictures of a sewage farm. That's because the kingfisher happens to particularly like this outlet pipe from the sewage farm. So I know there's very inventive photographers out there who could turn an absolute gem of a picture of a sewage farm. But anyway, leave the comments behind if you've got a particularly nice photo of a sewage farm. Naughty. Well, the answer to this one again is a yes. Unfortunately for me and my fellow semi-professional photographers, anyone can capture a good landscape even on their mobile phone. You don't need the latest gear either to get a landscape shot, so best to go to your local camera store, Castle Cameras here in Salisbury, seek advice. A great magazine to buy for advice is the Outdoor Photography magazine. They cover both wildlife and landscapes, particularly locations for landscapes. It's one I bought virtually from my start of my digital wildlife photography anyway. Well worth the subscription price. You used to be able to get it on Tesco Club Card vouchers for the canny shopper in England, but I'm not sure you can do that anymore. Anyway, and of course, watch other episodes of Camilla and I for advice on how to take wildlife photographs. So, do you need to be an artistic person? Well, I'll give this an emphatic no. You don't have to be artistic, and the reason is, we'll take myself as an example. Although my mother is a very good well, she was a very good artist in her day. I wasn't. So bear that in mind. My brother called my first painting a bomb going off under a horse. It was actually a sunrise coming up from underneath a sort of shire horse. It was actually a very badly drawn horse, and yeah, I had to concede that, in fact, a bomb going off underneath a horse was probably a very accurate description looking back on it at the time. I suppose I was about 14, slightly deflated, but 14, it was about right. I'm no artist, and I really appreciate the skill of those who can sketch and do pastels and oils. There's some incredible artists out there, absolutely amazing. So, do you have to be good with computers and Lightroom, etc.? In a word, yes. It certainly helps if you're really good with a computer. I know some people, some photographers, they're virtually all computer. The photo they take is unrecognisable by the time they finish with it in Lightroom and Photoshop. They are absolute computer wizards. I'd like to point out here and now on Camilla I, what you see is what you get. We don't add anything, even to our landscapes. We don't stick people in or extra birds or anything along those lines. What you see is what you get on Camilla I. So I wish I was better on the computer. I must admit, if you like, you can get a young whippersnapper come to your house and totally humiliate you in front of your own computer. In Lightroom, it's incredible what they can do, but why not? If you can suffer the embarrassment, bring them on in. I have in the past. Well, this would be definitely landscape photography. You have more time, you have more time to plan your visit, your time of arrival, sunrise, sunset. You can calculate your time according to moon phases, the stars alignment. You've got lots of things in your control, not just the weather. So yeah, I would definitely start with landscape photography. It's not necessarily easier, landscape photography. I mean, you may still have to walk up a mountain to get your shot. Like wildlife photography, you do still tend to take a series of shots with landscapes, and it's surprising how it's usually only one image out of the series of landscapes you've taken that is actually any good. So that's very similar to wildlife. You think you've got loads of keepers in the bag, and when you get home it's actually one shot that is actually good enough. With landscape photography as well, you've got the opportunity to master your controls and settings. Unlike wildlife photography, where everything happens in an instant, you have got time to adjust your settings. Ooh, tricky question. I don't want to land myself in trouble with all those landscape photographers out there. Indeed, the highest accolade I've received so far in my wildlife photography is actually to have one of my prints purchased by a world famous landscape photographer through my shop in Salisbury. Now, I won't tell you which famous landscape photographer it was, but this photograph did feature in the Outdoor Photography magazine, which I put up. Well, anyway, I do still take the odd landscape photograph, just happens to be with a 600mm lens though, usually these days. Another reason I switched from landscape to wildlife photography was because I felt I'd mastered exposure, composition and light, and I needed a new challenge. And yeah, wildlife photography is definitely a new challenge. Another thing about landscape photography was the possibility that you'd have to travel vast distances to get different shots. I mean, I just about exhausted Salisbury Cathedral and Stonehenge in Wiltshire. So yeah, you do have to travel further afield. Whereas wildlife, well, the wildlife we do on Camilla and I, we do accessible local wildlife, usually in Wiltshire, Dorset and Hampshire, close. So I embarked on a path where you add a new layer of skills really with wildlife photography. You have to get to know your subject, working with your camera in an instant. Action can last for a fleeting 2 seconds. You can wait for 2 or 3 hours and just get instant action with wildlife. And of course I also like the adrenaline rush of that special moment when you encounter that creature you haven't encountered ever before. And I like the drinking coffee as well. I quite like that. Thanks, Morton. I quite like drinking coffee. Oh, and the other thing you learn as well with the wildlife photography is you have to have the patience of a saint. So, yeah, my dad had that in bucket loads. So, yeah, I'm very lucky in that respect. I inherited his patience. One thing I'd point out here is it's highly addictive and you tend to spend more than you should. So and you end up pushing yourself beyond your limits, and you become also your own worst critic, and you do develop this sort of perfectionist attitude, well, if you really get into it, and a sort of anal level of detail. It is phenomenal. So yeah, big warnings. Of course, you never stop learning in landscape and wildlife photography. You can always teach an old dog new tricks. Another thing you learn is that you need a bigger computer, not just a bigger camera. Anyway, a bit different, this sort of question and answer session. I hope it's been of some use to you. Let me know in the comments below if it's been totally dreadful, and whether you're sticking to landscape photography. I haven't persuaded anybody to jump from landscape photography, or perhaps I've put somebody off completely going into wildlife photography and I've saved you an absolute fortune. You're the sort of people I want to hear from in the comments below. So yeah, let me know what I've done right. Don't tell me what I forgot to mention. Anyway, it's not a comprehensive list of requirements for wildlife photography, and I'm certainly not saying wildlife photography is better than landscape photography. It's just totally different. So yeah, go easy. Comments below. Do you do both types of photography, landscapes and wildlife at the same time, and you think I'm a wimp? Do you favour wildlife photography over landscapes, or vice versa? Let me know. And yeah, have I put you off? I said that. Anyway, whatever you do with your camera, just get out there and use it, because of course it's like all these things, sitting in the cupboard, it doesn't do any good at all. So get out there. You're allowed out in nature, in the great outdoors. Photograph away, and let me know what your next project is. Have a good one. Bye from Camilla and I.